Barry Weiss invited you to contribute to her new enterprise, and you decided to do that in a particular way. You're already writing columns, and so you weren't particularly interested in doing more of that, having been doing enough of it. Yeah. What are you doing with Barry?
It was a brilliant idea of hers. She wanted me to do a column for the Free Press, and I said, well, I'm sort of columned up. I write about 3 or 4 columns a week, and on various issues of the day. And she said, well, I want you to write about something else. And I said, well, look, I've always tried to have a deal with my editors that I write about something I love for every piece about something or someone I hate. And actually, the equilibrium has never been quite right on that. There's much more news coverage in the things that annoy you. But nevertheless, I do try to write about things I love. And it was Barry's idea. She said, well, look, whenever I'm on a stage with you, you always sort of seem to have things you can pluck out of the air, quotes, from things. Why don't you just explain why you got them in your head and where they're from and why you think they're worth having there? And so we came up with this idea. And every week I write a column about a poem I have by heart. Sometimes it's a longish poem. Sometimes it's a few lines. And really it's about why it's up there.
How much poetry do you know by heart?
Well, I'm doing 50 poems for this year. Ranging from, it's mainly within what you'd think of as the classical canon. Yeah. Western literature.
So why did you start doing that?
Well, there's several reasons. One is if there's something I read which hits me in the solar plexus, I want it up there. Yeah. That's a very strong. I think. I need that.
Do you know why you need it?
Well, then there's that. The answer to that is, and I actually addressed this in one of the opening columns, there were several people who made a great impression on me when I was growing up. One was a sermon I heard from Terry Waite, who was a captive in Lebanon in the 80s, because he was taken hostage after being the emissary of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I heard him give a sermon as a schoolboy where he talked about when he was chained to a Beirut radiator for about 5 years.
Right.
One of the things that made it bearable was that he had 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot in his head. And he recited the opening, time present and time past, both perhaps contained in time future. And he did that whole opening, which culminates in that great footfalls echo in the memory down the passage, which we did not take, through the door we never opened into the rose garden. And when there was something immediately struck me. I immediately went back to my room and got my Eliot off the shelf and finally understood Eliot or began to understand Eliot for the first time. But the other thing was, and I wrote this recently in a column about an extraordinary Russian woman who should be better known, called Tatiana Gnedich. Now, she was a woman. I tell the story in the piece, and I've only seen it in one other English version. She was a woman who was studied English literature in St. Petersburg in the 1930s and 40s. In the height of the terrors, she was actually denounced at her university because one of her forebears had translated, I think it was Ovid, into Russian. And she was very proud of this forebear, but somebody denounced her as having noble lineage, of course.
Oh, yes.
So she was denounced and thrown out of the university. She was eventually allowed back in. And to cut a long story short, but it's an amazing story, she ended up, after she was at the siege of St. Petersburg, her house was burnt down and her mother was killed. In about 1944 or so, she handed herself into the authorities. She'd got it into her head that wanting to go to England constituted activity against the state. That was how bad it was, the sense that you were doing wrong.
It's like trying to leave California.
Right. She handed herself in and she was given straight away 10 years in the Gulag. And on the night she was at the holding prison, she was told by the guard, there are books in the prison before you're taken to Gulag. And and she said, "Shut up, I'm working." And he said, "What are you working on?" She said, "I'm translating Don Juan of Lord Byron's in my head." Now, the poem is 17,000 words long, 17,000 lines long. And he said, "Okay, I'll give you a piece of paper and a pen and I'll come back in the morning." And when he came back in the morning, she had translated into Russian all of the canto in which Don Juan goes to Moscow. And he laughed uproariously at the brilliance of this translation, the humor of Lord Byron, that she had exactly done in verse, in Russian, in the same rhyme scheme, that the very complicated rhyme scheme that Byron uses in the English original. So he said, if I keep giving you paper, you think you can finish it. She said, yes. It took her 2 years, and she was in a cell on her own, and they gave her the paper.
Wow.
And at the end, the guard allowed 3 copies to be typed up and gave her one, then sent her to Gulag for the next 8 years. And she completed her sentence. And when she came out of the Gulag, she had her pile of papers, and she went to a friend's house, and there was an apartment, and 5 people were living in the room, and she joined them, and she stank of the Gulag by all accounts, as did her manuscript. But she then typed it up again with the revisions she'd made in the Gulag. It was subsequently published, and it is still to this day the standard translation of Byron in the Russian language.
Some people, man.
And some people.
Yeah.
And it was actually put on stage and was a massive hit within her lifetime. So she went from, she had a heart attack on the first night, which she fortunately survived. But I tell this story, and I told it after the one on Byron and on Don Juan, because it's always been my belief, and to me, it's an insight that's not original, but I've got it from various people, which is what you have up here, the bastards can never take. They can.
How much of that? So I have a friend in Canada, Rex Murphy, who's extremely erudite and literate and charismatic, and maybe Canada's most remarkable journalist. The sort of person that CBC actually produced, because he was a CBC production, so to speak. And would have produced more of had they actually done their job. And instead of even setting themselves at odds against him, which they eventually did, he has knowledge of a vast corpus of poetry. And it's evident in the manner in which he speaks, because he has that lilt and cadence and rhythm that's part and parcel. Well, and you're very, very well spoken. How much of that do you think, can you tell how much of that is a consequence of having internalized?
It's probably that. And in my case, the great good fortune of being brought up with the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. Right. Which, if you have them in your head and you recite them every Sunday, gives you a pretty good idea of how to cadence the English language.
Right. Right. So that's an extension of the same thing in some real sense. Yeah.
But I do think that, I think that, and I don't know, as I say, I got it from various people when I was growing up, but I think the sense that you have to furnish your mental furniture, and you have to furnish that well with the best things, because you might need it someday.
Yeah, it's more
in
like
fact, you'll need it any day.
It's more like a tool house than furnishing.
Absolutely.
You bet.
You'll need it any day, but there might be a day you really need it. So far, I've managed not to be chained to any radiator for years upon end, but I like to think that I could try to get by.